Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for that warm introduction. After hearing him repeat my statement about the ninth largest economy in the world, I might have to start keeping my mouth shut sometimes. So, in your packages, the program, there's a bio on me. I thought I'd share a few extra incidental things that normally don't get published. I'm born and raised in Los Angeles. My family actually moved from Louisiana in the 30s. Come from a large family, 10 kids. And I'm a product of Los Angeles, and when I do this work, the thing that impresses upon me now as I age is how I got started in this and how I would have never believed I'd be doing what I'm doing today. But I'm a product of the Watts riots, 1965. I was 11 years old when that happened. And so you come to this work now with some understanding of what things used to be like, where they are today, and how you hope for them to be better in the future. And actually, I left the banking industry in 1988 and started consulting and being involved in the first days of community development finance in Los Angeles. And the thing that actually motivated me to stay in this space was the second riot that we had in LA, the one that's associated with Rodney King. And share with you just a short story that I was actually on the freeway, headed home from just accepting a job to go to work for a major thrift. Because I'd been out consulting, and for those of you who started your own small business, you have good days and you have bad days, and hopefully you have your good days outnumber the bad days, but sometimes it gets a little edgy. And at the time, my wife and I decided that maybe you should go back and work for a bank. So I interviewed and accepted this position. And then on the way back on the freeway, helicopters were flying around. And in LA, helicopters flying around is usually not a very good sign. Something's going on. So I turned my radio to talk radio. And I actually hear and understand that now, there's another civil disturbance that's just starting to break out. So by the time I get to my mother's house to pick up my daughter, we lived in Compton at the time, and then drive from Compton and get back to my home, which was over by the airport, I decided that I wasn't going to take the job and go to work for this thrift, because I really believe that if somebody like me, a native of Los Angeles, who has some financial skills, didn't get involved in trying to change this dynamic, LA would keep setting itself on fire. And so that's what's brought me into this space, and that's why I will stay here. And I've done this community development finance now much longer than I ever was a commercial banker. And so in some respects, I think that adds some color to a lot of the discussions that we've heard earlier today, where a kid like me from the quote-unquote wrong side of the tracks in a bad public school can still turn around and make a major contribution to their neighborhoods, their city, their state, their country. So when I got the call to consider doing this, I started to think about, what am I going to talk about in Memphis, Tennessee? What do I bring that's coming from Los Angeles that might be something that you find informative, interesting, or even educational? And in Los Angeles and California, I use a lot of maps to have these discussions with financial institutions. Since the organization I run is a nonprofit finance company, and many of you may know the CDFI acronym. If you do, we are now a CDFI. When I started this, there was no such thing as a CDFI, so I don't know if everybody caught up with me or we decided to get in line. One of those things is true. But if you look at the maps, I put up the map that comes from the DRA website, which shows the red there, the areas of greater distress. And to both sides of it, I put up a map that I use in LA. And the maps that I use in LA, one of them has a demography that shows poverty, and the other one shows race. And you see the circles, which I think Dr. Johnson said earlier that he talked about deserts. Well, when you deal with low income and communities of color, you find out there's all kinds of deserts. So one of the ones that's become popular to talk about, food deserts, which is probably in the last 5 years, maybe 7 years, has become something that is being embraced on a large scale. I was doing independent supermarkets in 1984, where people didn't have access to quality foods, and at the same time didn't have access to any grocery store, particularly. And in my own childhood, I remember when the chain stores left Watts. So I came to that particular space with, a really real world understanding of what the problem is. And I can remember getting in the car and driving, 25, 30 minutes to go grocery shop with my parents. So it's not that this was ever lost to me, and I knew the magnitude of the problem. And what you had to try to do to try to solve it is, like most things, you got to find some money. At the end of the day, it costs money to solve problems. And I tell people all the time, they say, well, what do you do? What's a CDFI? What's all the stuff? I said, really, I'm in the relationship business. I am trying to put relationships back in low-income and communities of colors that have broken down over the years for a variety of reasons. And we have to figure out ways to make these connections. So my maps show the red circles, and I call those capital deserts. That's where it's very difficult to raise capital. And the maps that you see show the little black dots, which I was working with a financial institution that just went through a merger and it got acquired by CIT Bank. And under the Community Reinvestment Act, you're required to serve all the communities in which, in your assessment area, places where you do business. And you can see in the capital desert, there are no black dots. And I used to ask the guys at the bank, so how are you guys going to serve the market if you're not there? If you have some magic formula, or are you going to put stuff on drones to come over and fly over, take your deposits and take it back? Or you're just not going to serve the market? So that's part of the reality of what I deal with, is how to make those connections, working with financial institutions to try to be the bridge that helps them get back into communities where, for a variety of reasons, they've decided that they couldn't make any money, or it wasn't going to be very successful for them to do that. And I think we're finding out to a great degree that, on the contrary, these communities have needs. They can be served in an economic fashion, but you really have to understand how to do it. So in 2005, I was the chair of the Urban Land Institute, ULI, Los Angeles District Council. And when I took over that spot, I decided to try to think of something that, in the short time period that you have, 2 years, to get people to focus on and says, well, let's try to move the dial on something. And I came up with this acronym, HEAT. And so this brief presentation is about turn up the heat. And so I'm going to suggest to you that this is a framework around these 4 things that you can help build a strategy of success in low-income and communities of colors. So, very important things. Housing. And you've heard a lot today about housing, the difficulties that we're having with it, across the country, in all markets. Clearly, we've heard a lot about education and how that's the backbone to creating success. Economic development is a true catalytic activity that I think is often misunderstood and sometimes poorly executed, and takes on a wide variety of forms. And then finally, something that I've come to understand is transportation is becoming, at least in my experience now in California, the panacea for everything. If you can solve the transportation problem, all good things will come. That may or may not be true, but it is something I think we all have to focus on and try to figure out what the proper resource allocation is and solutions that could be tied up in that. So this is what I call my HEAT framework: housing, education, economic development, and transportation. And I'll try to share a few factoids on each of these components. So housing. Affordability in housing has been talked about. I have a good friend who some of you in the room may know. His name is Tony Salazar. He runs the West Coast operation for McCormick Barron Salazar, which actually is one of the leading firms in building communities, rebuilding communities in low-income neighborhoods and communities of color. And Tony actually went back through some slides that I had from a conference, I think it was 2006. And one of the things in Tony's slide is you have to understand that affordable housing is not an economic activity. It requires deep subsidy, which means somebody's got to pay for it. And if we don't all decide to do that, we're probably going to continue to have issues of affordability that we've never seen before, especially as our economy continues to do this barbell kind of transition that's happening now, where the wealth disparities are pretty wide. And then I was a public housing authority commissioner in Los Angeles for a while. And in addition to growing up in Watts, I walked through and lived around 3 large public housing sites, and there was 3 of, I think, 10 that we actually have in Los Angeles. And I was going back on Facebook this morning with some of my housing friends, and somebody put up a notion that we ought to change the moniker, if you want to call it that, and stop calling it affordable housing. And so you saw all these kind of things kind of popping up of what we should call it. And I recall that I was in South Africa last year for ULI doing an advisory panel there. In South Africa, they call it social housing. And I don't believe there's much distinction of what you call it, is you got to fund it. And that's the key component. If you can't fund it, you'll probably end up with generally what I call an under-resourced housing strategy is public housing. And for any of you that are involved in public housing or know of public housing, it's a situation where we have been trying to figure out how to undo the housing policies that happened in the past to create a more sustainable environment for which people to live in it, but it does take kind of great subsidy. So old models got to be thrown out. We got to think of new ways of doing things. And I'm sure you'll hear, some interesting ways to finance this stuff from Tom Murphy in his presentation, because he's looked at this ostensibly. But affordability in housing, it drives, I think, how people think about their neighborhoods. And countless examples from Los Angeles where if you just mention the word affordable housing, everything shuts down because it's viewed as housing for a certain class of people and not for everybody. So that's one of the founding principles of this HEAT framework, is how do you deal with housing? Education. I was actually pretty impressed by listening to the other speakers, because I had no idea there was going to be this real discussion about workforce development, which is actually an area where I don't do a lot of work in, although I try to be on the side of helping expand companies and organizations that actually do hire people. But the ability of actually trying to figure out the workforce component, I think, is extremely important as we go forward, because at lunch I was talking to a couple of fellows who own their own small companies, and they were talking about the problems they have in attracting labor force to work for them. And they said, we have good paying jobs. And part of it, to my surprise, or maybe not to my surprise, was that it's hard to get young people interested in what we do. Their notion of where they ought to be and what they ought to be doing is probably very different from, if there's a bunch of baby boomers in the room, maybe you've done what I've done. I wish I could come back as my daughter, that kind of thing. And I try to get her interested in what I do. I go, this is a pretty good profession, If people travel around the country to talk to them. Only internship she got paid when she was a student. Everybody else got her for free. But she's happy. She's doing, like most LA, California kids, they all want to be in entertainment. And so she's in entertainment and happy with that kind of stuff. But the notion of education, and the reason why I have this slide up, this is a private school, K through 8, that I helped them construct their first permanent building about 3 years ago. It was a school that got started by a bunch of parents in the city of Long Beach in an industrial area. And then when I met them, they were at the point where, we want to be a real school, so let's start putting down roots. And they wanted to build their first permanent building. And I did this in 2008. And I did this in a financing structure which probably is not easily replicated, because you have to find somebody like me who probably doesn't know any better sometimes, where I financed the school because their bank, in this case, Wells Fargo was their bank, was very happy with the $2 million loan that they had for financing the modular buildings that they had helped them open a school with, and really wasn't interested in taking on, more debt with the school to build these new buildings. And I couldn't convince them to work with me, and although we've had a long, successful relationship in doing these kind of stuff, but they told me, says, look, Mike, if you want to do it, you have our blessing, just don't tank the school. So I ended up making a mezzanine construction loan behind a big bank to get this first building up and done. Everything happened on budget, on time, great success. One of the things about what I do is if you do it, you're lucky or unlucky, they come back. And so they showed up about 9 months ago. Mike, got a new deal for you. We need 4 buildings this time, and it's $5.5 million. And I go, guys, you gotta understand, that first time was a real special set of circumstances. This is not a regular off-the-shelf kind of product. And I was doing it against a capital campaign. So they hadn't raised all the money, they had pledges. And for those of you who would take a pledge as a way to get repaid, hold your hands up and I want to talk to you later. But I ended up taking them to a couple of banks and found one that was willing to work with them. But here was the kind of secret sauce that made it work, and I think it goes to this notion of what you're talking about today and how to collaborate. California, I think maybe 20, 30 other states, were the beneficiaries of the Small Business Credit Initiative that came out of the 2010 Jobs Act, and I'm sure Tennessee got money. California got more money than anybody else, $169 million. Most states were somewhere in the $20, $25 million range. That class of money I was able to bring forward, put in this transaction with the bank where they got a cash deposit of $2.5 million to hold as collateral. And if something goes wrong, the bank can effectively tell the state, well, you're not getting the money back right now until we work it out. But it's those kinds of collaborations where a nonprofit organization that has a specialty in the finance, figures out how to work with a bigger bank who, may or may not get this stuff. But I have to go through and kind of demystify it for them so they can and talk their language. So then they feel more comfortable that, we could do this and it might work, and then bring them into the picture. And the beneficiary of it is a nonprofit school that is trying to upgrade its community. So this is an example of how in the area of education, and most people know about charter schools, and we've done charter schools too. But the one thing I would say in this educational vein is that if you go to a marginal school, a quote unquote bad school, most parents always really still want to know, well, where's the good school? So have some way of judging the differential and what are we shooting for? Because we all want to send our kids to great schools and have them be highly educated, and so they can, as Dr. Johnson said, take care of us later in life. I didn't have the 2.1, so I'm down. 50% with only a single child, so I don't know what I'm going to do about that. But so that's an example how, from my perspective, from a tactical standpoint, how you put something that has to do with improving educational opportunities in low-income neighborhoods or neighborhoods surrounding them in practice. Economic development. I have been using this definition probably for about a decade, and it comes from a good friend of mine, Dr. Ed Blakely, who ran the planning school at USC in the 90s. And I'm sure if we divided this room, put half of you on one side, half on the other, and tried to get some consensus on what economic development means, we're still probably going to end up with a wide variety of answers, because it means different things to different people depending upon what your point of view is and what your goals and objectives might be. So this is an academic explanation or definition of what economic development is. And from my perspective in the work that I do, one of the things I harp on, and especially when I'm talking to community-based organizations, this is all about a value proposition. What separates a low-income community or a community of higher poverty from one that is not, is usually the economics. Is their tax base? Is their wealth? Those are the things that get you out of the red and put you into another color bracket. So creating net wealth, net income, net job growth is the way I try to look at it, because there's a lot of ways to measure economic development. In my industry, we measure it sometimes by the square footage of buildings, number of seats in a school that you're adding to a market. There's a lot of ways to do it. But at the end of the day, the thing that moves the dial the most is, quite frankly, it's money. And being able to account for delta that includes a value proposition. So let me give you a couple other factoids that I kind of looked up briefly. So in my business, I've done, since 95, about $350 million of pushing capital into low-income communities and communities of color. High number of the transactions that involve people of color. My guess, top of my head, the number's probably about 60%. So a couple $100 million that have gone to companies that are operated and owned by people of color, or nonprofit organizations that are run and directed by people of color. And in the CDFI industry, California has used about $4 billion worth of capital in various forms that have come through the Treasury Department, whether it be New Markets tax credits or kind of direct grants to organizations to do lending and investment. Not sure if you know, but I kind of aggregated up your region, $4 billion. So in that case, you're even comparable. Now, I didn't go to detail and look at where all the uses have gone. California is a huge real estate related kind of economy, so I'm assuming that a lot of our stuff went into real estate. But again, I'm trying to figure out what are some of the parities. And I think that when I even looked at this and I looked at California, if somebody would say up front, we're going to put $4 billion on the table to you, we all thought about it differently. If you knew that was up from day one, as opposed to over a 10-year period, $4 billion on a competitive basis coming in. And I mentioned this to the extent that I would suggest that for those of you who have some experience with the Treasury Department and the tax credits programs and even their core program, continue to talk to your federally elected officials that it's a good thing. And we like to have more of it, and we like to think about ways of innovating to make it easier, because it's a huge opportunity to leverage. To the extent that you have thoughtful financial institutions in your region that want to grow customers, and we've heard about how the customer base in the reality is changing. The customers that they had for the last 25 years will not necessarily be the customers for the next 25 years. Programs like New Markets tax credits, the CDFI fund, those kind of things will help provide some cushion to allow you to work in new markets and find new customers, while the traditional sources of financing may be a little skittish. And in fact, in my business practice, we always characterize ourselves, we're the place you go when the banker says no. So we're always thought about as the solution provider in kind of a complex situation that is going to be outside the general credit box of a financial institution. Our job is to move things as close as we can to the box, incubate them, and then turn them over. So the financial institution starts to see, well, we started on Skid Row in LA with, the nation's highest homeless population, a block over in 2000. And we go to today, there are people living in converted office buildings that were built in the 30s that were formerly vacant. Tax base has gone up tremendously there. And I would have never believed it if somebody would ask me. 30,000 people out on a Thursday night going in an art walk. Unbelievable. Had I thought that was going to be the reality, I'd have bought some more buildings myself. So, if you can prime a market and get it to rise, everybody can be the beneficiary of it. But I do say in the world of economic development, I'm one that tends to want to bet on small and medium-sized enterprises. Although there is plenty of reason to have major drivers from an economic standpoint in the sector, you got FedEx, whether that you have, a EdMed kind of complex. I think there's safety in more numbers. So And you never know who's the small to medium enterprise today that's going to turn into the FedEx, of tomorrow. So nurturing small, medium-sized enterprises, I think, give most regions, communities, a lot more resiliency economically because all your eggs are not in one basket. And also, I think that helps promote the collaboration between government, business, and the community, which is also going to be a driver. Because in my experience, small and medium-sized companies typically hire locally. And because they're owned by folks from the community, they typically have a much harder time leaving because this is home. Usually you could say, well, where's the CEO's house? Oh, that's where the company's going to be. But eventually they can turn into public companies, and then it's a whole different ball game. And then you have to grow the next wave of them. Transportation. I'm a neophyte in the transportation world and don't claim to be an expert in any shape, form, or fact. Don't tell anybody, but I don't even ride public transit in LA. I'm more apt to ride it outside of Los Angeles because, in LA, when I was growing up as a kid, the first thing you ever wanted was a driver's license and a car. And the whole world changed for you then, and I don't know if I've outgrown that yet. So, but it's a huge factor now, I think, in how we move people around, how you get them from the home. I had a friend who used to say, a house is a place where a job goes to sleep at night. So those things are integrally connected. Los Angeles, we're doing big dollar transit systems right now. We agreed to tax ourselves by a sales tax increase of 0.5 cents for $30 billion worth of improvements. And then took that $30 billion commitment and went to the federal government and says, we want to do all this stuff and we want to do it in 30 years. And so there are like 7 major rail projects going on right now. Now, because of that success, they're now talking about a $120 billion program that they're thinking about putting on the ballot. And I'm going, that's a lot of money. And we'll see what happens with that. But because the region is, geographically so spread out, a lot of the $30 billion has gone into places where there's no benefit outside and suburbs around the city of Los Angeles. So part of this $120 billion now is going to, increase the pie, get more people in, because the more people you have buying in, the easier it is to get consistency. And it goes again to this notion of collaboration. Tell you a couple of things that are being done that you might think about if you're, pursuing these kind of endeavors here. You put in transit, you go through and you tear up the street, and some people go out of business because they can't last the 2 or 3 years it takes to get a project done. So in LA, one of the things that they decided to do, they created a business interruption fund. So if you're a small business and you're in a corridor where construction is going on, you can actually go in and bring your documents and say, look, my business is being injured by this. I'm down 10, 20%, whatever the number is. They will evaluate your request and effectively give you some money. Not a lot of money in some cases, and it really was structured at the kind of mom and pop level, which is probably okay as a start. And if I was to advocate, I would say you need to move it up the target a little higher, because if you think about an example I would give you, if somebody has a fast food restaurant of some kind, Burger King, McDonald's, they might hire 40 or 50 people because those things are running now 24 hours. In Los Angeles, they would not be eligible. Although when you look at a corridor, they might be one of the largest employers by bodies in the corridor that this transit is going through. So you have to tinker with some of these things as a way to do it. So that's one thing that you might think about, a business interruption fund. Other thing they decided to do, and they're going to do this system-wide for the 6 projects that I mentioned. They started the first one. They created a business solution center. So it was a way to put resources for small businesses that were being impacted by the rail construction on location. So you could kind of walk in, find out what's going on, and see what kind of resources are available to you. And it's being modeled now, and hopefully by next year it's going to be rolled out for the other 5 other transit projects. But it's a way that I think that when you have these large-scale public projects, I have found that there's usually great concern by the communities about what's going to happen to me when this all gets done. And the other side of it, it's what's in it for me. So in order to have them feel like their concerns are going to be addressed, and what we're seeing in Los Angeles is the notion of community benefit agreements are popping up for anything that has to do with public resources being put in place. And so developing these kinds of tools as part of a community benefit agreement is probably something that will be helpful in the long run. And you may be able to at some point to other successes outside of your market to say, well, look, it works over there, maybe we ought to give this a shot. And also I think it helps to deal with the issue of, who rides transit. In Los Angeles, transit is a system that is generally used by people who choose not to drive somewhat or cannot drive because they don't have cars. So there's an income kind of disparity that goes on in Los Angeles in terms of who uses the transit. So if that's your beneficiary, having things that actually embrace your beneficiary as part of the overall project can only help, I think, in raising the awareness of the value of the project and also the benefits that are accrued to the users. In addition to the kind of big picture, air quality issues, reducing the carbon footprint, all those kind of things that we might buy in from a larger societal basis. So those are 4 components that I would say weave together, and that's kind of the framework for a discussion that you can feel free to steal and call it your heat strategy. Oh, now I can't even see this one. What is this? Okay, so collaboration. Am I still mic'd? Can you hear me? Okay. In as much as that was one of the things that is important today, when I think about collaboration, I am finding myself, because I work with financial institutions who have their own foundations, and then sometimes there are large local foundations, people are trying to drive collaboration together now. Now, whether that's good or bad, I think it's kind of too soon to tell, but I'm seeing more and more proposals that come out that say, tell us how you're going to collaborate with your partners and weave this whole thing together. And I think in some cases it's starting to blur the lines. So a collaboration involves a nonprofit partner, a business partner, a chamber, or other kind of community-oriented stakeholder of some kind, are all coming together. And then you have to think about, so what's the commonality of the impact that we want to produce in this collaboration? If you're running a business, it's pretty clear what your focus is. It tends to go to the bottom line. It's maybe financial. If you are running a social services organization or some other nonprofit, even my company, a finance company that's tax exempt, we just don't want to go out of business. It's not about how much we're returning to shareholders. It's really how much are we retaining to have future impacts is what we're really looking for. So I think these lines are blurring, which means you're going to have to now think about how do you organize some discussion about the return on investment, because you have different resources coming in looking for different kinds of outcomes. Some of this is driven by corporate responsibility. And for those of you who kind of look at this stuff, notice I left out the S. It's not corporate social responsibility, corporate responsibility. And I heard this used the first time about a year ago by Peter Schneer, who runs JP Morgan Chase's global philanthropy business, I think is what his title is. And I asked him, so isn't that a typo? Did you leave out social? He goes, no. We're just changing the dynamic, the way we want to think about it. And his answer was really customer focused. He says, we're going through the JP Morgan franchise and talking to customers about what they believe is corporate responsibility and how we can help them as our customers be more responsible as a corporate entity. So I wouldn't be surprised if you see more of this happen. And then the final thing I would say, community responsibility is probably an objective that we all have based on how we want to characterize community. I also think, and I would argue that our president is a good example of how community responsibility has changed when you have a community organizer become president of the United States. So the work I do, I will tell you that there are plenty of examples of communities getting better organized to put forth a position, talk about what their goals and objectives are, and again, how this collaboration will work. I would say the days of, okay, let me buy a 10-seat table for your organization dinner, those are probably going to continue to happen. But you might sit at the table now where at that table with the other 9 people, the ask is changing in terms of what we want to accomplish. And that's probably a good thing, because the more dialogue that we have about what the problems are and what the solutions might be, I think the better off we're all going to be. I think that's my last slide. I'll say one other thing and then I'll take some questions. And it goes back to this notion of collaboration. So one of the other things that I do, and this is kind of in this Banking Community Reinvestment Act paradigm, I'm a member of a statewide organization in California, which is called the California Reinvestment Coalition. Started about 25 years ago, a bunch of community people getting around trying to decide, okay, we have this CRA thing, it doesn't look like much is happening for us. How do we get together and figure out a way to make it more impactful? Ultimately turns into an organization that monitors bank investment under the Community Reinvestment Act. We meet with banks annually. We also talk about what we think are articulating the community's goals and investments and what could help. And I will tell you that my own personal experience of being involved with this now for about a decade, we have changed the minds of some bankers, although some of you might think that's impossible. But it has happened. And it's because if you come to the table with a value proposition, having been a banker and knowing that, the day job for me is satisfying customers' needs. And where are my customers? And then somebody can help me understand my customers better, understand what their needs are, and then even possibly bring some other resources to the table, as I mentioned in the CDFI fund and tax credits and those kind of, you can generally have a coherent conversation with most financial institutions, but you have to try to find where their sweet spot is, because all of them do something a little differently, and all of them may make judgments differently. So what flies through the door at one financial institution might be dead on arrival at another. But part of this is your ability to make sure you're having the right kind of interaction to understand what their needs are and how you might be able to play together. And so in my work with the California Reinvestment Coalition, I probably helped negotiate, this last, call it 12 months, $20 billion worth of community reinvestment pledges, agreements, and it usually is happening around bank mergers. One bank's buying another bank, and then you have to meet these regulatory hurdles under the Community Reinvestment Act. The largest one that we just negotiated, it closed, I think in March, was the Royal Bank of Canada bought City National Bank in Los Angeles. And City National Bank is actually it used to be called a bank to the stars. Started in Beverly Hills, and Frank Sinatra. In fact, the story is when Frank Sinatra Jr. got kidnapped, he walked into City National Bank and they gave him the cash out of the vault to go get his son back. So it was that kind of institution. And over time morphed into small business and wealth management. Royal Bank of Canada bought him, and we sat down and talked to the bank and talked to the folks from the Royal Bank of Canada and suggested that $10, $12 billion over 5 years would be a nice little pot of money to put together to try to have a positive impact on the communities. Under the pressure of trying to do a merger, gives you some leverage to have that conversation. But I would suggest that it's an ongoing conversation that you all should try to have all the time, because the one thing that I will tell you, you can go wherever you bank with. You can go to their website today, right? You can probably go to the investor relations page, and you'll see all kind of elaborate presentations about what they're going to tell investors and how well the bank's going to do, all kind of metrics, flashy PowerPoints. And if you go and say, okay, where is the stuff that says this other regulatory requirements you have for reinvesting in communities? There's no PowerPoint, there's no glossy presentation. You will see in some of them, especially the ones I've worked with, you'll see, demonstration documents that don't go into a lot of financial detail. They do talk about what they stand for and what they're trying to accomplish. But I think drilling down and getting, a Delta Regional Authority commitment would be something that you'd all be interested in. So you could say, well, we're going to have, with this bank, we're going to work with you. You guys are going to put, X amount of dollars on the table. This is not a gift. This is not charity, although some of it might be. It's really, what are the capital resources that we need to put in place to grow our economies, grow our region? Because I firmly believe no capital, no growth. No growth, we got a problem. And with that, I'll take any questions that someone might have. Yes, sir.
Have you used New Markets tax credits in any of your deals?
I have used virtually everything in my transactions because I have to. And here's the story for me about New Markets tax credits. So I was involved in the early days of negotiating with Treasury when they put the whole program in place. There was this guy, the attorney at IRS is Michael Barr at the time, and he's since gone on back to academia. But I sat there and, and negotiated with them and was part of getting the final regulations drafted. I will tell you, I've never gotten an award for New Markets tax credits directly. But I put $350 million into communities. So,
Part of the problem.
Well,
Part of the problem in market tax credit. You should be getting direct allocation.
that's what I keep telling them, but they're not listening to me. So, your support is greatly appreciated. But I would say it's important. It's important because, a lot of investment is motivated by tax implications of it. So what I typically have done is effectively done it the old-fashioned way. I got banks on one side who I try to convince to loan me money or invest with me. I have borrowers on the other side, and I'm in the middle managing this risk, just like when I was a banker. The unfortunate part now is I got to go to keep everybody happy, but it can work. Is a point I would make. It can work, and new markets are a very important tool, but they're just one of the tools. And the more tools that you know about, the more options you're going to have in solving a financial problem. And that's why people call me, because I don't tell people I have special programs or these kind of buckets of products and services. I go, no. Sit down, tell me what the problem is. Tell me what you're trying to accomplish. And then let me see if I can think of a solution that will get us there. Because sometimes I got to make up something new, which is why I do this. It's fun. Any more questions? All right. Well, thank you all.